Japan, the land of the rising sun, a nation renowned for its technologically advanced cities, traditional cultural offerings, and immense natural wonders, which together make for one of the most sought-after tourist destinations in the world, attracting millions of visitors each year. Surprisingly, however, this level of openness to outsiders is a relatively recent phenomenon in the nation's history. In fact, for well over 200 years from the 17th to 19th centuries, Japan's borders were firmly closed to any outside visitors whatsoever. This time period, known as Sakoku, bore witness to a flourishing of Japanese culture, rapid economic growth, and dynamic societal developments which up until that point had never been seen before. As a result, this gifted the nation with many of the iconic cultural treasures whose legacies have survived to this day. But how did this island nation undergo such a dramatic transition from a period of relative isolation into becoming one of the most developed and open countries in the world today? This is the history of Japan. The archipelago of islands that make up the modern nation of Japan have been inhabited for the best part of 40,000 years. With the first human settlers migrating there from mainland Asia, these early inhabitants brought skills such as agriculture and metalworking with them, which laid the groundwork for the establishment of permanent settlements and eventually the earliest kingdoms. By the 3rd century AD, a significant portion of southern Japan had coalesced into a centralized power structure based around the Yamato region, which was ruled under a system headed by a monarch known as the emperor. Much of Japan's early history would be shaped and influenced by cultures from the Asian mainland, with Buddhism being introduced to the region in the year 552 from Korea and later in 645. A series of reforms known as the Taika reforms being implemented to remodel the political landscape of the country and mirror the Chinese system based around an imperial court. This court initially did not have a permanent home and was moved to a different location with each passing emperor. That was until 794, when Emperor Kanmu decided to fix the capital in one place, modern-day Kyoto, thereby initiating the beginning of the Heian period, which was to last for almost 400 years. Over time, however, the imperial court became grandiose and too focused on internal politics, neglecting proper governance of the country outside of the capital and greatly weakening its own authority. As a consequence, the land that was formerly under the control of the emperor began to gradually slip into the hands of local noble elites, which led to the emergence of a feudal system where power was decentralized and not centered on the imperial court in Kyoto. This decline in the central authority of the state led to powerful regional warrior clans like the Taira and Minamoto grow in strength. Backed by the military might of their samurai warriors, they were ultimately able to challenge the dominance of the emperor during the Heiji Rebellion of 1160, which was sparked by disagreement over who should inherit the imperial throne. This in turn escalated into the Genpei War of 1180-1185, with the Minamoto clan, headed by its faction leader Yoritomo, eventually winning out over their rivals and subsequently establishing a new and separate military government based in the city of Kamakura, far away from the imperial court of the emperor in Kyoto. Yoritomo was able to go further and convince the Emperor Gotoba to grant him the title of shogun, or great general, in 1192, effectively making him the de facto ruler of all Japan and initiating a period of military rule called the shogunate that was to last for the next 700 years. The fighting abilities of the samurai would soon be put to the test once again at the beginning of the 13th century, when one of the largest empires in history turned its attention towards conquering Japan. In 1265, the Mongol Empire, headed by Kublai Khan, demanded that Japan submit to him as a vassal state. But after receiving no response, the Mongol leader began to plan a full-scale invasion of the country. The Mongol forces landed on the island of Kyushu in 1274 and met a determined, although significantly smaller force of samurai in battle. Despite being severely outnumbered, the tide turned in favor of the Japanese defenders when a powerful typhoon called the Kamikaze or Divine Wind suddenly swept through the region and destroyed practically all of the Mongol fleet. The Mongols attempted a second invasion in 1281, but remarkably faced the exact same outcome as what had befallen their predecessors some 7 years earlier, with their forces being wiped out by yet another typhoon. Although they had successfully seen off the threat of invasion, Japan's defensive efforts had nevertheless almost bankrupted the treasury of the shogunate, and consequently, many of the samurai were not paid for their services. This greatly soured relations between the military government and the samurai clans, and so, in 1333, Emperor Go-Daigo launched a coup with the aim of restoring power to reside with him as emperor and the imperial court in Kyoto. Despite being successful in this endeavor, this state of affairs did not last long. For just 5 years later in 1338, Go-Daigo himself was overthrown in another coup, which restored the power of the shogun under the new leadership of Ashikaga Takaichi. Even though the shogun's authority had been restored, actual power within Japan was retained amongst the regional samurai clans, whose feudal lords called daimyos directly controlled the land for themselves. These clans would often forge alliances and plot against one another to alter the balance of power within the country as they saw fit, which more often than not resulted in open civil war. The most violent of these conflicts broke out in 1467 with the Onin War, being fought to decide who would succeed the ruling shogun Ashikaga Yoshimasa. The daimyos took sides in the conflict and effectively caused the feudal system to collapse, carving up the country for themselves into a patchwork of smaller independent states. This chaotic time, known to history as the Warring States or Sengoku period, continued well into the 16th century and saw many significant military developments such as the emergence of ninjas who carried out covert assassinations and espionage missions, as well as the deployment of Buddhist warrior monks called Sohei on the battlefields. Although a paradigm shift in the fighting occurred in 1543 when a Portuguese trading ship was blown off course onto the island of Tanegashima, just south of Kyushu. The 3 Portuguese traders on board were the first Europeans to set foot in Japan, and they quickly established mercantile relations as part of the wider Portuguese trading network, which covered much of the Indo-Pacific region. Once a year, the Black Ship, as the Japanese referred to the Portuguese vessel, arrived off the coast to buy and sell merchandise, chief amongst which were European muskets. These weapons were completely unknown to the Japanese before this time, and as a result, they quickly proved popular among the feuding daimyos who were looking to gain a tactical advantage over their adversaries. So much so that by 1556, over 300,000 firearms were being used in the ongoing civil war. Similarly, the Portuguese also introduced Christianity to Japan, which greatly benefited their trading operations, with new converts being given preferential treatment in their ability to purchase guns, as well as in some cases receiving direct military support from the Portuguese themselves. One of the most prominent daimyos to cooperate with the Portuguese was Oda Nobunaga, who, although did not convert to Christianity, harnessed the technological superiority of European gunpowder weapons to great effect and began to unite Japan under his rule. During the final stages of his grab for power in 1582, however, Nobunaga was ambushed and killed. He was quickly succeeded by one of his followers, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a man of humble peasant origins who had risen through the ranks of the army to become a samurai daimyo, and who went on to complete the ambitions of his former master and unify the country. Despite being the de facto ruler of a now unified Japan, Hideyoshi didn't assume the rank of shogun, perhaps owing to his peasant background, and instead ruled as Kanpaku, imperial regent, as well as Daijo Daijin, chancellor of the realm. He intended to bestow these titles upon his son, Toyotomi Hideyori. However, being still only a child at the time, Hideyoshi asked his 5 most trusted subordinates to pledge loyalty to his infant son until the time came when he was old enough to assume power. As soon as Hideyoshi died in 1598, however, civil war once again erupted between the Japanese daimyos, with Hideyori's allies on one side and those loyal to Tokugawa Ieyasu, who was formerly loyal to Hideyoshi, on the other. The decisive battle came at Sekigahara in 1600, with Ieyasu being victorious over his rivals, ushering in a new era for Japan under the Tokugawa shogunate, which was to last for 268 uninterrupted years. This period, also known as the Edo period, owing to the shogunate government moving to the city of Edo, modern Tokyo, is perhaps the most definitive era in Japanese history. The relative peace and stability that descended upon the country allowed for Japanese culture, the arts, and the economy to flourish in a period of prosperity. It did, however, come at a cost, for the Tokugawa shogunate introduced a series of harsh punitive measures to quell any potential form of social unrest and severely clamped down on Christianity, spreading further within the country before eventually outlawing it entirely in 1638. In order to prevent any further foreign influences from taking hold in the country, the third Tokugawa, Iemitsu, introduced a policy known as Sakoku in 1639, which effectively closed the country to outsiders and prevented any Japanese people from traveling abroad, returning from overseas, or building ocean-going vessels. Limited trade was only permitted with neighboring China and Korea, and the only Europeans granted a trading license were the Dutch, who were confined to the small island of Dejima off Nagasaki. The remainder of the 17th century saw Japan continue to prosper and flourish under the successive Tokugawa shogunates, with the population doubling to 30 million and the government constructing roads and schools to greatly improve the socio-economic output of the country. However, by the late 1700s and early 1800s, cracks had begun to show in the strength of the shogunate. The rapid growth in agriculture that had defined the early years of the Edo period had come to a halt, and the government's response to devastating famines during the 1830s was severely inadequate. While all this was going on, some Western ideas had gradually begun to take hold in the country. Owing to the introduction of Dutch books covering the most recent European scientific discoveries, which were translated into Japanese and distributed from their trading base at Tajima, Japan's period of isolation would come to an abrupt end in 1853, when a fleet of American warships led by Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Edo Bay. The US government wished to open Japan's ports to international trade and was prepared to use military force to secure this goal if necessary. Being unable to match the superior firepower of the US forces, the shogunate reluctantly agreed to Perry's demands and opened up the country to American commercial interests, later extending this policy to other Western powers such as Britain and Russia. This seeming capitulation to the Western powers angered many within Japan, particularly those from the southern provinces of Choshu and Satsuma. They quickly formed an alliance and, in 1868, convinced the young Emperor Meiji to issue a decree calling for an end to the Tokugawa shogunate. The armies of Choshu and Satsuma then marched on Edo, leading to the Boshin War and ultimately the downfall of the shogunate. The emperor subsequently regained supreme power over the country, marking a significant shift in Japan's governance. In 1869, the imperial court relocated to Edo, which was renamed Tokyo, and formally signaled the start of the Meiji Restoration. This would witness Japan embark on a new journey towards modernization, aiming to become a fully fledged nation-state on par with the Western powers. Under the Meiji government, priority was given to modernizing infrastructure, with the introduction of railways, telegraph lines, as well as a universal education system and lifting the ban on Christianity. The government also enlisted the expertise of hundreds of advisors from Western nations who shared their knowledge in various fields such as mining, banking, law, and transportation to help further Japan's modernization efforts. One particular area of focus was on the military, which underwent a significant adoption of the latest Western tactics and technologies. In 1877, this updated army was deployed to quell the Satsuma Rebellion, which had broken out due to the grievances of local samurai who had seen their roles as the nation's traditional fighting force become obsolete in the face of a modern standing army. Japan's new military might was also put to use in expanding the nation's territory overseas in an attempt to replicate the colonial possessions of many of the Western powers of the time. After securing control over Hokkaido and annexing the Ryukyu Islands, Japan turned its attention towards China and Korea. In the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895, Japan's highly motivated and well-led forces achieved a stunning victory over the larger military of Qing China, successfully annexing Taiwan as a result. In 1902, Japan signed a significant military alliance with Britain in order to counter the rising threat posed by Russian expansion in the region. The inevitable clash with Russia ultimately came at the Battle of the Yalu River, which marked the first time in decades that an Asian power had defeated a Western one. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904–1905 culminated in the dramatic Battle of Tsushima, in which Japan's newly built navy virtually annihilated their Russian opponents. These military successes allowed Japan to assert its dominance further across the region by annexing Korea in 1910, thereby positioning itself not just as a regional power, but now as the predominant Asian power on the world stage. Motivated by these recent military triumphs and further aspirations to expand across the Asia-Pacific region, Japan joined the Allies in the First World War with the aim of acquiring new colonies in the South Pacific that were nominally under German control. Following the conclusion of the war, Japan participated in the Treaty of Versailles and enjoyed favorable international relations, which were bolstered by its membership to the League of Nations. However, like many other countries during the post-war period, a growing nationalist and fascist-inspired sentiment began to take hold within Japanese society, particularly within the military, whose expansionist ambitions were becoming increasingly bolder. These aspirations triggered the outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937, which saw further territorial acquisitions on the Chinese mainland and a growing distrust of Japan's intentions in the region by the international community. Alarmed by this aggression and increasing levels of expansion, the United States imposed harsh economic sanctions on Japan to hinder any further war effort. With the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939, Japan realized that it needed to realign itself geopolitically with other nations who shared similar expansionist views, and consequently forged an alliance with Germany and Italy in 1940, which further worsened its relations with the US. Japan also alienated other Western powers such as Britain, the Netherlands, and France by occupying further territory in Southeast Asia and encroaching upon the colonial possessions of the European powers. Ultimately, however, Japan's government, under the leadership of Prime Minister and General Hideki Tojo, decided that it would need to preemptively strike against the United States if it was to lift the economic sanctions imposed upon it and secure the recent territorial acquisitions it had made in the Pacific. On the 7th of December 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched a surprise attack on the American fleet station at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. This assault prompted the United States to enter World War II on the side of the Allies and begin military operations against the Empire of Japan, which had by now conquered other territories in Asia, including the Philippines, Malaya, Hong Kong, Singapore, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies. The Allies, spearheaded by the United States, engaged in a fierce and prolonged conflict across the Pacific against Japanese forces. One of the key objectives was to secure small islands with strategically placed airfields that could be used for launching bombing raids on the Japanese mainland. However, the increasingly costly and slow progress of the fighting led the United States to realize that a ground invasion of Japan itself would result in incalculable losses for their troops. As a result, they decided to utilize a newly developed secret weapon to compel Japan to surrender. On the 6th and 9th of August 1945, the US dropped 2 atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, causing the deaths of well over 100,000 people. The surrender of Japan was conveyed to the Allies on the 14th of August and was publicly announced by Emperor Hirohito on national radio the following day. With the war over, Japan came under the occupation of Allied forces led by General Douglas MacArthur, who initiated the reconstruction process. The Japanese military was disarmed and the government underwent a process of democratization. Although Emperor Hirohito was allowed to remain in his position, he was required to publicly disavow his divine status, which had become a central tenet of the state Shinto religious system. Under the guidance of Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida, Japan shifted its focus towards economic development rather than pursuing an assertive foreign policy. By 1955, the Japanese economy had surpassed its pre-war levels, and by 1968, it had emerged as the world's second-largest capitalist economy. The following decades would see Japan establish itself as a global leader in automobile manufacturing and as a major player in the electronics industry, resulting in an economic boom that was backed by Japanese-made consumer goods. All of this post-war economic activity helped to shape and mold Japan into the successful nation that it is today, one that ranks high in almost every measure of global output and development, from economics to technology and even life expectancy. All of this is owed to the arduous work ethic and tenacity of the Japanese people, who, after having suffering hardship during the final stages of the world's most destructive conflict, decided to embark on a different path altogether towards rebuilding a modern nation-state that was free from the hostilities, divisiveness, and inequalities of the past.